welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, welcome. My name is Luciana and I'm an Indonesian American YouTuber based in the US. Now in this video, I want to talk about the model minority myth and why it's dangerous and offensive not only to the non-Asian American communities but also within the Asian American communities. So the model minority myth is a stereotype that Asian Americans are the model minority, that we have worked so hard and that we are so educated that we become successful in the US, and that other minority races, mainly Hispanics and the Black communities, should try harder just like us to be successful too. This is clearly very offensive to the Hispanic and Black communities, but it's also very dangerous to the Asian American community. Naturally, this model minority idea drives a wedge between Hispanic and Black communities and the Asian American community. Plus, in reality, it's not even true that Asian Americans are the model minority. It is a ton of pressure for us, and it erases our individuality as Asian Americans, and it makes Asian Americans look like we're just one race, but we're really a lot of different races within the Asian American category. The model minority idea paints a picture that Asian Americans are the most educated minority and the wealthiest minority race. The reality is, not all Asian Americans are educated. Not all of our Asian immigrants who came to the US came in with high education. And not all Asian Americans who are considered educated are successful. In my previous video, I mentioned that even Asian American women who have graduate degrees are the group that is least likely to be promoted into executive roles in corporations. Now, we can't talk about the model minority idea without talking about the systemic racism and bias that the Black community and other people of color have been facing for decades here in the US. By saying that Black and Hispanic communities should work harder, should try harder like Asian Americans to be successful in this country, the model minority clearly ignores all the systemic racism that still exists to this day that the Black community and other people of color in the US have been facing for decades. And again, that this systemic racism still exists until today. So let me just talk a little bit about some of the systemic racism. Usually when people talk about this systemic racism, they're talking about the Black community, but honestly, this applies to some of the Asian American communities too, because like I mentioned, Asian American is not just one race, it's one category, but within the Asian American category, there's so many, there's like some 20 plus Asian American races. So as I'm talking about the kind of systemic racism that still exists in the US today based on race, please keep in mind that this is not just for the Black community, but some of the Asian American communities experience the same systemic racism. Schools that are predominantly non-white annually received $23 billion less than schools that are predominantly white. And this is because more than 35% of public school revenue comes from property taxes of wealthier areas, while public schools in other communities must rely on state funding, which is volatile. Black students, indigenous students, and other students of color, including Hispanics and Asian Americans, are more likely to attend schools that are under-resourced, outdated, and even hazardous to their health. In 2020, more than half of the US public schools needed to update or entirely replace their HVAC systems or plumbing systems. And a lot of these public schools are located in high poverty areas. Hazardous school conditions like this causes more asthma attack and higher absenteeism in the students. And again, keep in mind, these are predominantly students of color who go to these schools. And then that in turn negatively affects the students' performance in school. And like I mentioned, a lot of these schools are in high poverty areas that have less local revenue than schools that are in wealthier areas. And like I mentioned before too, not all Asian Americans are wealthy. There are Asian Americans who live in high poverty area, and we will get to that in another video talking about the poverty rates of the various Asian American groups in comparison to the poverty rate of the US in general. That will be in a different video, so stay tuned. When there are state budget cuts, these budget cuts affect high poverty area more than it affects the wealthier areas. There were budget cuts during the 2008 recession, and even after the recession, these funding levels for these schools were never recovered. And then there were more budget cuts during the COVID-19 pandemic. Other than funding, there's also teachers' biases against students of color. 1 month before the murder of George Floyd, the American Education Research Association conducted a survey to examine teachers' racial bias. And they studied, if I'm looking down, that's because I'm looking at my notes, okay guys? Now, they studied about nearly 69,000 teachers, and they found that 77% of these teachers have implicit bias against dark-skinned students, and 30.3% of these teachers have explicit bias against dark-skinned students. And I will put the articles that I read, my resources for these numbers, down below in the description box if you want to take a look at the actual articles directly. Now, these racial biases negatively affect the students' learning experience, the quality of education that they get, and also how the teachers manage them in the classroom. These racial biases also make it less likely for students of color to be put in advanced classes. And in fact, these biases make it more likely for students of color to be put in detentions and to receive punishments. College admissions entrance exams like the SATs and the ACTs also have bias in them against students of color. Theoretically, SAT and ACT are supposed to be objective comparisons of students between high schools, but these tests actually disadvantage students of colors and low-income students and students with disability. There was an analysis that was done in 2015 that found that students whose family income is less than $200,000 were more likely to score lower than students whose family income was $200,000 or more. And it also makes sense that these tests are biased against low-income students because the prep that you have to do to take these tests are expensive. I remember when I was taking SATs and ACTs back then, I was taking, I think like just the book itself was expensive, and my family was a middle-income family. And I took both SAT and ACT, and those prep books were already expensive. There were also classes that you could take to prep for these SATs and ACTs, and the books themselves were already expensive, so the classes were even more expensive. Me coming from a middle-income Asian immigrant family, we couldn't even afford the prep classes. We could only afford the books, and so I only studied from the books. But I can imagine that there are other lower-income students, you know, Asian American or Asian or not, that would not even be able to afford the prep books. Then if you don't prep for these tests, then you wouldn't do well in them. That's how the bias affects the students' scores on these SATs and ACT scores. And also, research found that races that are stereotyped to be bad at math tend to score lower than races that are stereotyped to be good at math. Now, Asian Americans are one of the races, or maybe the only race, I don't know, that is stereotyped to be good at math. This stereotype is not true. Not all Asian Americans are good at math and science. In fact, I'm one of those Asian Americans who isn't good at math and science. I completely suck at science. I took the ACT twice, and science was always my lowest score. Now, I consider myself average at math. I'm really not that good at math. In order for me to get a good score on the SAT math topics, or even in my math classes, I had to study really hard for it. So yes, there is a stereotype that Asian Americans are good at math and science, but that stereotype is a generalization that is wrong. The model minority concept or idea, like I said, ignores the systemic racism that the Black community has been facing for decades, but it also ignores the systemic racism that still exists against Asian Americans. Some of the systemic racism in the US that apply to low-income students, that applies to some Asian American groups too, because again, there are Asian Americans who come from low-income families. Not all Asian Americans are wealthy. In 1965, they restricted US immigration in a way that attracted Asian immigrants that are highly educated, and I think that's one of the things that the model minority idea is based off. And again, like I mentioned in my previous video, Asian Americans are still underrepresented in leadership roles and executive roles in corporate America. And to this day, Asian American women are still facing the bamboo ceiling in the workplace, meaning that Asian American women are still underrepresented in executive roles in US companies when compared to other races. And heck, even Asian American men are still underrepresented in executive roles in US corporations. Alright, so my third point, which I mentioned before in the beginning, that this model minority idea is also very dangerous to the Asian community itself, because it puts a lot of pressure on Asian Americans to live up to the stereotypes that Asian Americans are highly educated, that Asian Americans are good at math and science, that Asian Americans always get good grades. The model minority idea, like I mentioned before, erases the individuality of Asian Americans. This stereotypes put so much pressure on us that it affects our mental health. Growing up as Asian American, I was expected to be good in math and science. I was expected to get all straight A's. Anything less than an A- was like a big no-no. When I didn't meet these expectations, I was blamed for it. Like, you didn't try hard enough, you didn't study hard enough, even though all I was doing was study, especially for math and science, because those are the two subjects that I was worst at. I didn't have to study for English classes, I didn't have to study for art classes, because I have more of an artistic side. That's kind of more where my talent is. But when it comes to math and science, I really had to study a lot for it, to be good at it and to live up to these expectations. And the pressure that I felt to live up to these expectations drove me to attempt suicide. Not once, but twice. Asian American college students are actually 1.6 times more likely than other races to make a serious suicide attempt. Okay guys, there's two other parts, or I guess two other set of stereotypes that the model minority idea is based on. One is that Asian Americans are the most wealthy minorities in the US, and the other one is that the US has always been a welcome place for Asian people of Asian descent. And I want to talk about these two sets of stereotypes in my next video, so please stay tuned for my next video. These are two very significant stereotypes that cause all the anti-Asian hate that's been happening for decades and that's been rising since COVID started. So these two myths that I will talk about in the next video are also very important, so please stay tuned for my next video. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and turn on the bell notification so you know when my next video comes out. And thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye guys.